Welcome back to part 3 of the Mummy franchise, the Sommers series, and the Tom Cruise The Mummy. I'm going to try and not play favorites in these movies, and at the same time, I've also been too worried about being too critical of the Sommers series. I don't want to ruin the magic for myself. We once again see non-English use and non-European white cast members returning in the Sommers series. And the genre of these movies is very quickly and very clearly differentiated from prior series. It's gunslinging action-adventure with the use of supernatural threats, whereas the vast majority of all prior movies followed the horror genre with psychological or supernatural suspense. From this point on, we leave behind the bandage-wrapped appearance of the mummy, which, in modern cinema, is likely necessary as it would come off as cheesy and B-movie-esque. It's hard to take that threat credibly. This change also allows the mummies to connect more in a way that a masked villain can't. It forces the writers to give them a personality, and it forces directors to give them human-like movement. Let's begin with The Mummy in 1999. The intro is the background of The Mummy, which at this point I think is my favorite time slot for this. Compared to the length of the movie, I feel like the prologue is just the right length. It doesn't overdo it, gives us just enough setup of the story, and it prepares you for the supernatural danger without overdoing any part of that. The intro also gives us the first glimpse of the Tomb Guardians, the Magi. As in previous movies, they are willing to kill and die to protect the tomb's secrets. Their influence and formidability are well pillared by Ardith Bay and Dr. Terrence Bay. However, their intimidating presence is undercut by their somewhat lackluster ability to actually prevent the groups from reaching and entering Hamunaptra, the city of the dead. Ardith Bay, Evelyn, Imhotep, and even Jonathan are all characters reincarnated in this series, with characteristics taken from prior movies. Yet each character successfully distinguishes itself from the prior incarnations. Unlike in prior iterations, Ardith Bay chooses to side with the protagonists in the aim of taking Imhotep down permanently and doesn't betray them. Evelyn is empowered and a competent archaeologist, not some throwaway love interest. Imhotep is far more powerful. We see that he has terrifying powers with his ability to speak and act independently, and he has a far greater ability to stand out and bring an original take on the mummy. Jonathan, while there's not too much to compare him to in his prior iteration, that being Ralph Norton from the very first movie in 1932, he does have a far larger role that leaves the character memorable, if only as comedic relief. But we also have original characters. Rick, a gunslinging rogue, is not a character trope we have seen before. Benny, the out-for-himself character, is also an original. In fact, I think he's one of the best standout characters of the film. He provides the perfect foil to Rick throughout the film and meets a satisfying demise in the tomb. The mummy returning and desiring to bring back his ancient love and vengeance on the openers of the tomb are all returning tropes and might as well be the core requirements for a mummy movie. But Hamunaptra is refreshing. It could be considered a returning device as well. However, it's been so significantly changed and enhanced that it would be unfair to say so. Sommers could have produced the greatest horror entry of the series between the plagues, the slow generation of Imhotep toward human, and the tomb's traps. But by going the adventuring route, he still successfully produces an adventure movie that builds on fear. If anything, the only thing I can point to as a fault is the continuation of Imhotep's lost potential of a paired mummy to work with. We have been teased several times now with a second mummy, that of his lover. This partner has yet to pose any real threat in these entries, and it's disappointing. I personally would love to see a mummy movie in which we have two mummies who have been reunited and now seek revenge, or seek their own destiny. Following this, in 2001, we had The Mummy Returns. In this sequel, we are given the introduction of a new threat, the Scorpion King. Scorpion King himself would later get a spin-off of his own series with 5 entries released so far. His story is very cliché world conqueror, but it's missing a critical component that could have made it more compelling, and that's his motivation. The film only shares in the intro that he wants to conquer the known world. Had he been given a backstory like maybe how he escaped being a slave, or he was a man betrayed by the world, it would have set him up as much more interesting and driven me to care about him more. Following our introduction, we return to the now family of O'Connells from the prior movie as they are searching through a new tomb. This scene works very well in setting up each of the family members as characters. We quickly learn about the child's personality, and we get caught up on the status of Evelyn and Rick's relationship. This is also the point in which the prologue and the story connect. as the pair discover the bracelet of the Scorpion King, and just as importantly, we ourselves discover that Evelyn is having supernatural experiences, such as visions, the origin or reason for which is not given until later in the movie. That being that she is the reincarnation of the Egyptian princess Nefertiti. There's very little reason as to why she is suddenly imparted with this power after not having any signs of it in the prior movie, and that is honestly a bit of a detraction from the movie. It's a bit of a blindside, and at times really just feels like a retcon. Following our introduction to the heroes of the story, we transition to the villains, working to uncover Imhotep in the books of life and death from the prior story. Our bad guys are now the cult of Imhotep, led by a femme fatale Milanese, the reincarnation of Ankhsu-Namun, and then we have Baltus Hafiz, the leader of the cult. There's no complaints here. We see that his cult is very committed to their cause and begins the setup to an overarching danger of the entire movie. It's all very well done. Our 3-act setup might be a bit lengthy, but with the various plot devices, characters and groups, and threats, it's necessary in this film despite causing it to have a slow start. Thankfully, each component is short and we quickly get into the action with Imhotep being resurrected so early in the film. One thing this movie does very well is world building. For instance, we get to learn more about the Magi. They have 12 tribes, each with commanders, and then we have the expanded lore with Rick being a protector of man and a warrior for God. Admittedly, it's a thin line between new lore and retcon, and there's a lot of this film that walks that line, but does so in a way that only if you were intentionally trying to be critical would you really notice. Some parts of this movie felt very out of place for the series, and the world established in the prior film. Particularly, the ship-blimp combo felt like something out of a fantasy movie like The Golden Compass. Then we have Imhotep's reduced powers. He no longer has the world-ending powers, and rather they are far more reduced, even comparing to where he was in terms of power and his journey with similar points from the prior movie. It's clear they wanted to retract his powers to make him a bit more grounded. The last part for this point I want to highlight is the highly over-dramatized fight in a flashback between Ankhsu-Namun and Nefertiti. It was very jarring in terms of what we expect from the choreography and setting. The last part I have to bring up here is at the Shakespearean end of Imhotep's story. We've seen for 2 movies now that everything he's done and every life he's been given is to work endlessly to bring Ankhsu-Namun back. And in his final moments, he reaches out to her to save himself and she chooses her own life, running away and condemning him back to the underworld, only for her to die a mere moment later. Imhotep's story is a true tragedy, and you're able to feel sorry for him by the end. As an independent series, this movie would have been better served leaving Imhotep in the underworld and focusing on the Scorpion King. That threat was dealt with, and the story might have been more well refined, only concerning itself with the new threat. As an entry in the franchise, I completely understand why Imhotep had to be brought back in this film. From this perspective, the film maintains its place in the franchise through the use of a returning mummy. It's a great action movie, and it's entertaining, which is really all an adventure movie needs to be. Our third and final film in the Sommers series is Tomb of the Dragon Emperor from 2008. The Dragon Emperor receives just as well-crafted prologue as any of the Egyptian mummies. It establishes the villain, sets up the different characters, and gives hints to future plot points and devices to be expanded on later in the movie. The writing for this movie is incredibly cheeky. When we first meet Evelyn, she is asked if the character in the book she has written is in fact based on her. She responds that she's an entirely different person, which of course is the movie saying front and center that she is played by a different actress. The movie seems to be trying to establish her as her own character rather than fitting her into the same personality as the Evelyn we have come to know through the 2 prior movies, which sadly only hurts the performance. While cheeky, it's also just out of place. What I mean is, it feels like the lines were all spoken in the 2000s rather than any attempts being made to sound more like the 1940s when the movie was set. While the other movies in the series are incredibly likely to be entirely inaccurate for the time period, it's written to be easier to suspend your belief. And I think that is one of the major parts of where this movie fails. And then we also see character developments walked back. Evelyn's advancement in such areas as combat, from her status as a reincarnation, is completely ignored. The personality and portrayal of Alex is far too opposed to that of the prior movie. Yes, we can say, well, he's grown up now and was just a child before, but we're talking about a movie here, and that excuse rarely ever works. Rick seems to be the only character that has held onto his prior personality, which is quickly evident in this audio flashback while looking at his French Foreign Legion uniform hanging in the closet. He maintains the same level of humor, same competency in combat, and his personality is nearly identical to that of the prior movie. So there's lots to say negatively about this movie, right? But let's remember that as an action-adventure movie, the point is to be entertaining. With the introduction of China as a setting, we get to see the change in action choreography toward the use of martial arts. This brings a change of pace to the action scenes, which is, truthfully, a breath of fresh air in the franchise. And it opens the door to a new resurrection method, which in this movie takes the form of the Eye of Shangri-La, which contains mystical water from Shangri-La. And lastly, since this is China, we get terracotta soldiers rather than the mummies and Anubites. I think the post-World War II years were a great choice for the setting of this movie. It's not particularly relevant to the story, but you can read into it deeply enough to see how it might be influencing certain elements, like the army wanting to bring order to the world's chaos. If we call it a spin-off, then there's less issue to take with it. And if we took the mummy out of the title, I think there would even be less criticism to give out. Ultimately, the point I have to return to in ending this discussion of the Dragon Emperor is that by taking it as anything other than just for the purposes of entertainment, only leads us to giving a poor review. Between the damage to the characters, poor writing, and some of the action scenes, it's sadly a flop for me. That being said, I still enjoyed it as a movie, and in particular, as Brendan Fraser's last work in the franchise. And finally, that brings us to the 2007 edition, The Mummy. Amenet is a scarier mummy than any prior iteration. I think part of the problem is that the cinematography of this movie makes it come off as something from the 2000s sci-fi fantasy, like Van Helsing or Underworld. It makes it feel less modern, and I think that might be a source of disappointment. This movie also walked back the use of non-English language that was growing increasingly common in the franchise, a choice that's really disappointing from a progressing Hollywood. Amenet's sarcophagus reveal after the tomb has been opened does a great job of setting up the tone and what to expect in this film. Between visions, the strange behavior of spiders and crows, and even the physical appearance, you can immediately surmise that the mummy is meant to be, and will be, more horrific than what you've been exposed to before. This only makes it more disappointing that when the mummy does reveal itself, her method of regeneration is by sucking the life out of others by making out with them. It's just outdated and off-putting. There are so many better ways to display sucking the life energy out of somebody other than having to make out with them. There's a lot of poorly done representation of the military as well. If you're going to include the military, I feel like you need to do it adequately. They call in an airstrike to a village but don't identify where. Or there's something as simple as identifying the bodies in the morgue. In reality, they would all have dog tags, and you wouldn't ask an archaeologist who's not affiliated with the military to identify the soldiers. And then there's Nick, our primary protagonist. He's supposed to be military trained, but his character clearly doesn't display much evidence of it. Honestly, he's treated more like a mercenary on loan to the US Army rather than an actual member of it. As for the mummy, rather than being a tool for a cult or searching for a lost love, this mummy just wants power. It's a change, but not one that betters in this movie. It makes the mummy less compelling and harder to sympathize with. Another big change in this movie from others is that it feels more like a single hero movie rather than team-oriented. Nick is the main protagonist, and Ginny almost feels like a side character. She isn't given the ability to shine as the archaeologist or to be assertive enough to take the leadership role, and she pretty much just serves as a damsel in distress. And his friend Chris is left to die very quickly and pretty much just takes the role of a forewarner. Ginny and Chris continue to make appearances in the movie, and Ginny arguably is on the screen very heavily, nearly as much as Nick, but it's clear that she is not meant to be a strong, independent character. As for the action in this movie, it's less fisticuffs action and more psychological horror and suspense, which I do love, and I do think is the right direction to take if you're trying to show it's different from the Sommers series, which is important given the relative short distance between the series. As far as the script goes, it's not the worst of either the franchise or contemporary movies from the late 2010s, but my real issue is with the delivery. There's so much pausing between words in the same sentences, the dialogue just ends up slow. As a franchise intrigue, it maintains some of the core elements of the Mummy franchise while taking several liberties. It tries to be original, but in doing so in the way that it does, it comes up short. As an individual movie, it's an entertaining, edgy action movie, and that's okay. That's enough to make it an enjoyable movie to watch. Sure, it's not broadly appealing, but every 30 to 60-year-old white guy can sit back in a recliner and enjoy it. As a movie attempting to start a cinematic universe, it should have been like the third in the series. If we already had a reason to care about the organization, and Ginny was an established character, this film could have been far better off from a viewer's perspective. You're setting expectations way too high for a monster cinematic universe if, in the first movie, you make your main protagonist a living god. Thank you for joining me in part 3 of the Mummy franchise miniseries. It has been a thrill to watch these movies over the last few weeks and get to review them. We'll be back with the final part, lightly exploring the expanded world of the Mummy, including video games, comics, and spin-off movies, as well as giving some final thoughts on the franchise as a whole.